Hey guys, tonight we delve into a story that chills the bones, a tale of madness, manipulation, and haunting violence, the infamous Manson family murders. It's a story that still echoes through the halls of history, leaving behind a chilling legacy that continues to haunt the minds of those who dare to learn its details. Imagine it a quiet evening, a house nestled in the hills of Los Angeles. The warm glow of the porch light flickers, casting long shadows across the yard. The house is silent, but only on the surface. Inside, the stillness hides an unspoken tension, as though the very air has been thickened by some dark, malevolent force. A sense of dread that clings to the walls, unseen but undeniable. Outside, the world is unaware of the horror that will soon unfold, a nightmare taking form under the cover of night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It was the summer of 1969, a time of free love, peace protests, and cultural upheaval. But in the hills of Los Angeles, far from the flower power and the songs of Woodstock, there was a different story unfolding. A twisted tale woven from the threads of charisma, manipulation, and madness. At the center of it all was Charles Manson, a man with a dark vision, a hypnotic presence, and a following of vulnerable souls who believed in his every word. Manson, a failed musician and convicted felon, had somehow managed to draw a group of young people into his orbit. He preached a message of revolution, of race wars, and of spiritual awakening. To his followers, he was not just a man, he was a prophet, a messiah. His words were gospel, and his will was absolute. They called themselves the Manson family, but it was not a family in the traditional sense. It was a cult, one founded on the worship of Manson and his warped ideals. Among his followers were women, girls really lost and searching for something more, something they couldn't find in the world outside. They were drawn to him like moths to a flame, their loyalty unquestioning, their devotion absolute. They had become part of Manson's vision, his twisted family bound by a shared belief in the coming of an apocalyptic race war, a war that Manson promised would bring them power. The story of the Manson family would forever be linked to one summer night, a night when Manson's most disturbing vision would take shape in blood and horror. In the early hours of August 9th, 1969, Manson sent a group of his followers to a house in the Benedict Canyon area of Los Angeles. The house belonged to actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant with her first child. Sharon was not just a beautiful actress, she was the wife of film director Roman Polanski, a man whose career was on the rise and whose life was about to be shattered in the most unimaginable way. Sharon, along with 4 friends, was spending the evening at her home, a peaceful evening far removed from the chaos that Manson was about to unleash. The night was warm, the sky a deep ink-black canvas above the house. Inside they laughed, drank wine, and talked of life, the future, and dreams. Sharon's unborn child kicked inside her, a reminder of the new life they all hoped would come soon. But in the shadow of the hills, Manson's followers were preparing for something far darker. They crept through the night, their footsteps silent, their minds clouded by Manson's orders. They were told to make a statement, to commit a brutal crime that would ignite the revolution Manson had spoken of. The murders would serve as a sign, a message to the world. They were to kill in the most savage way possible, to send shockwaves through the hearts of the rich and famous. As they reached the Tate house, they made their move. Inside, the unsuspecting guests had no idea that their peaceful evening would soon turn into a nightmare. The group, led by Manson's most devoted followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel and Linda Kasabian entered the house. They were armed, ready to carry out their leader's twisted vision. Sharon Tate, along with her friends, was in the house's living room when the first scream pierced the quiet night. The attackers stormed in, knives and hand-eyes, wild with frenzy. Sharon tried to flee, but she was trapped. The brutality of the attack was unimaginable. Sharon, pleading for her life and the life of her unborn child, was brutally slain. Her friends, too, were murdered with horrifying speed and savagery. But the nightmare was not over. As the attackers left the house, they wrote a chilling message in blood on the front door, "Pig." The word was meant to send a message, a symbol of the revolution Manson had preached. It was a violent act meant to stir up fear and chaos. But what Manson and his followers didn't realize was that their twisted acts of violence would not spark the revolution they had hoped for. Instead, it would mark the beginning of their downfall. The murders, brutal and senseless, would eventually lead to their capture and conviction. And yet, even in the aftermath of their arrest, Manson's influence lingered. His twisted ideology and his ability to manipulate people remained a dark stain on the history of the era. The world was left to grapple with the question, how had a man like Charles Manson been able to deceive so many people, leading them down such a path of darkness? As the investigation unfolded, the true horror of the Manson family's crimes began to emerge. It wasn't just the murders themselves that were terrifying. It was the mind that orchestrated them, the man who convinced others to carry out such grotesque acts. And even as the trial played out, the story didn't end there. The Manson family murders would go on to inspire countless documentaries, books, and films. It became a symbol of the darkest aspects of human nature, a reminder of the destructive power of manipulation and madness. As for the house in Benedict Canyon, it was eventually torn down, but the echoes of that night still haunt the land. The tragic events of August 9th, 1969 are forever etched in the collective memory of the world, a chilling testament to the horrors that can unfold when people are swayed by the wrong words and the wrong leader. The days following the Tate murders were filled with confusion and disbelief. The Los Angeles Police Department was in turmoil, struggling to comprehend the horror that had unfolded on that fateful night. It seemed impossible that such a violent, random act of cruelty could be connected to a single person, let alone a group of followers. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that the Manson family, a group of people who had seemed so ordinary, were capable of unimaginable evil. In the weeks that followed, detectives began to piece together a chilling pattern. Manson's followers had been living in a secluded ranch in the hills of Los Angeles, a place known as the Spahn Ranch. It was a dilapidated former movie set, a place where time seemed to stand still, and the world outside was nothing more than a distant echo. Manson had created a world of his own on the ranch, a place where his followers were isolated from society and immersed in his delusional teachings. The ranch became their sanctuary, but also their prison. The Spahn Ranch was a place of twisted rituals where Manson's control over his followers was absolute. The women, many of them young and impressionable, had come to him seeking something they couldn't find in the world outside. In Manson, they saw a leader, a savior, who would guide them to a new world. And for a time, they were willing to do anything to please him. But as time went on, Manson's grip on reality began to loosen. His teachings grew more bizarre and erratic, his rhetoric more dangerous. He spoke of a coming race war, a battle between blacks and whites, in which the Manson family would rise victorious. He called this war Helter Skelter after a Beatles song that he had twisted into a symbol of chaos and revolution. His followers, swept up in his fevered vision, believed that the war was imminent, that it was their destiny to be the catalysts for this violent revolution. On August 10, 1969, just hours after the murders at the Tate House, Manson and several of his followers gathered at the ranch. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a feeling that something monumental was about to happen. Manson spoke passionately, his voice rising with fervor as he told his followers that the time had come to act. He sent them out to commit more crimes that would send shockwaves through the city and stoke the flames of the revolution he had so deeply ingrained in their minds. The next night, the Manson family carried out another brutal murder, this time at the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. The couple, who lived in a quiet neighborhood in Los Angeles, had no idea what was coming. They were victims of a crime so senseless, so vile, that it left the entire city in shock. The LaBiancas were stabbed multiple times, their bodies mutilated in ways that were almost too horrific to comprehend. The words, "Helter Skelter," were written in blood on the walls of the house, a chilling reminder of the madness that had gripped the Manson family. But this time, there was something different. The murders at the LaBianca home seemed even more frenzied, more chaotic, as if the family's madness had taken a further step into unhinged violence. The night was thick with fear as Manson's followers returned to the ranch high on adrenaline and the belief that they had played their part in a greater purpose. Manson greeted them with approval, his eyes alight with something darker, something far more dangerous than mere satisfaction. In his mind, the helter-skelter revolution was just beginning, and he believed that these acts of violence were only the start of something much bigger. But the more violent the acts became, the more unstable Manson's mind seemed to grow. What had begun as a warped form of charisma and manipulation was now a full-fledged spiral into delusion and madness. As the police worked tirelessly to piece together the events of the murders, they slowly began to connect the dots, beginning to understand the twisted relationship between Manson and his followers. The investigation into the murders, though slow at first, began to pick up momentum. Detectives found that several of Manson's followers had been arrested for smaller crimes, and it didn't take long for them to connect the dots to the murders. Susan Atkins, one of Manson's most devoted followers, was the first to crack under pressure. During her time in custody, she confessed to the murders at the Tate and LaBianca homes, describing in chilling detail the savage killings that had taken place. Atkins' confession was a turning point in the case. As the authorities delved deeper into the investigation, they learned more about the horrific acts carried out by Manson and his followers. The more they uncovered, the more they realized the depth of Manson's manipulation and control over his followers. His ability to warp their minds to convince them that they were carrying out a righteous cause was disturbing in its power. But the story didn't end with their arrest. As the trial began, the world watched in stunned silence as Manson and his followers stood before the court, faces twisted with defiance and arrogance. Manson, always the master of manipulation, tried to turn the courtroom into his own stage, using the proceedings as another platform to preach his bizarre ideology. His followers, still loyal, supported him in the courtroom, and the trial became a surreal spectacle, a reminder of the dangers of blind obedience and the destructive power of a charismatic leader. In the end, Manson and several of his followers were convicted for their roles in the murders. Manson was sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life in prison. The Manson family's reign of terror had ended, but the scars left behind by their actions would never fully heal. The murders, brutal and senseless, became a symbol of the dark side of the 1960s, a time when idealism and rebellion were twisted into something far more sinister. The Manson family murders would go on to inspire books, documentaries, and countless discussions about the psychology of cults and the dangers of unchecked charisma. But even decades later, the question remains, How did Charles Manson manage to manipulate so many to turn them into willing participants in his horrific vision? The night grows still again, the warmth of the evening hanging in the air like a soft shroud. In the quiet, the terror of those long-ago days slowly fades from your mind. But as you drift into the darkness, the echoes of madness still linger just at the edge of your thoughts. The aftermath of the Manson family's gruesome murders reverberated throughout the world. What had started as a series of violent acts soon became the subject of endless speculation documentaries and books. The Manson family murders were not just another true crime case. They represented something far deeper, a terrifying glimpse into the human psyche and the extreme lengths to which a charismatic figure could manipulate and control others. As Manson and his followers were sentenced to life in prison, the public began to wrestle with the question, how could they have fallen under his spell? How could young, seemingly innocent people be led to such violence by a man who was little more than a failed musician with a violent agenda? But it wasn't just Manson's words that had pulled his followers in. It was the perfect storm of circumstances. The world of the 1960s, filled with political unrest, social upheaval, and the promise of freedom, was ripe for exploitation. Manson tapped into that unrest, using it to craft a narrative that promised the followers something they couldn't find anywhere else: a sense of purpose, belonging, and a belief that they were part of a larger cosmic struggle. Yet as much as the world tried to move on from the horror of the Manson family murders, it would not let go. The chilling nature of the crimes and the lasting impact of Manson's manipulation ensured that they would never be fully forgotten. The case served as a reminder of the vulnerability of the human mind, particularly those who were searching for something to believe, in something that gave them purpose in an increasingly chaotic world. Even after the convictions and the fading of the initial shock, the story didn't truly end. It echoed in the halls of the justice system in countless conversations about cults and the psychology of persuasion. Manson's influence, though confined to prison walls, continued to linger in the public consciousness, a reminder of the darkness that can exist in even the most unassuming places. As the years went by, there were whispers that Manson had supporters even behind bars, those who believed that his vision was still true, that the race war he predicted was coming, and that they would rise up to fight for it. Some of his followers, like Charles Tex Watson, remained in prison, continuing to speak about Manson's ideology, fueling the ongoing mystique surrounding the Manson family and the horror that had been unleashed. The mythology of Manson grew with each passing year. His followers were often remembered as mindless, brainwashed individuals who blindly obeyed a madman. But the reality was far more complicated. Many of them had been manipulated over time, their minds slowly warped by Manson's constant rhetoric and psychological conditioning. They weren't born killers, they had been shaped into them. The story of the Manson family was one of vulnerability, coercion, and the terrifying ability of one man to shape the reality of others. Even as Manson himself aged in prison, his name remained synonymous with evil, with manipulation, and with the dark allure of a man who could make others believe anything. In 2017, after decades of imprisonment, Charles Manson passed away, but his legacy continued. His life and his crimes were explored in countless documentaries, and his name still held a dark fascination. People continued to ask themselves how he had done it. How had he, a man who had once been a failed musician and petty criminal, managed to inspire such loyalty, such devotion, such terror? The answer was elusive. Manson had preyed on the vulnerable, those seeking something to hold on to, something that gave their lives meaning. He had created a world for them, a world where he was not just their leader, but their God. In a time of cultural change and uncertainty, Manson's words became a refuge, his ideas a form of escape. But in the end, the cost of that escape was beyond comprehension. As the world tried to make sense of Manson's influence, there were still those who sought to understand the roots of his evil. Was it simply a matter of mental illness, or was it something darker, something more inherent in human nature? A reminder that anyone at any time could fall prey to the right combination of circumstance and persuasion. The Manson family murders were a catalyst for change, sparking a larger conversation about cult's manipulation and the power of a single individual to alter the course of history. But they were also a dark mirror of society's greatest fears. Manson had come to embody the dangers of blind trust, the perils of losing one's sense of self in the face of a charismatic figure, and the terrifying potential of human beings to commit the most heinous acts in the name of a cause. As night deepens and the sounds of the world fall away, the cold truth of it all settles in. The story of the Manson family is one of betrayal, manipulation, and horror. It is a reminder that even in the darkest corners of society, people can be led astray, and that sometimes the true evil is not what's on the surface, but the quiet, insidious force that twists and controls from within. Years passed since the Manson family's reign of terror came to an end, yet their crimes continued to cast a long shadow over history. The aftermath was a mixture of fear, fascination, and a deep societal introspection. How had they been deceived? How could so many fall under the spell of one man? The answer was elusive, slipping away like sand through an outstretched hand. But one thing was certain. Charles Manson's grip on the minds of his followers was a case study in manipulation, and his influence lingered far beyond the walls of the prison where he would spend his final years. As the world moved forward, the house in Benedict Canyon, once a scene of unspeakable horror, continued to haunt the collective imagination. It wasn't just a place, it had become a symbol, a monument to the fear and violence that had been unleashed that summer night. Despite the house being torn down, its memory was carved deep into the minds of those who had lived through it, and the blood-stained history would never fade. Even years later, the specter of Sharon Tate, her unborn child, and the others who had been slaughtered that night seemed to hover unseen, but ever present in the memories of those who dared to speak of it. But while the world continued to remember, there was another side to the story, one that remained largely untold. The survivors of the Manson family, those who had been drawn into his web and who eventually turned against him, had their own tales to tell. They were the ones who had seen firsthand the horror of Manson's ideology, and they knew the truth of how his charm and charisma had twisted the hearts and minds of the vulnerable. In the years following the trials, many of Manson's former followers sought redemption. They spent their lives trying to undo the damage they had caused, publicly speaking out against Manson's ideology, attempting to show the world that they too were victims of a man who had used their desperation, their loneliness, and their need for belonging to manipulate them into becoming instruments of destruction. Patricia Krenwinkel, one of the most infamous of Manson's followers, had spent decades behind bars grappling with the horror of her actions. Her life, like those of the other Manson family members, was marked by the duality of guilt and regret. Though her eyes had once been clouded by Manson's vision, she now spoke with a voice of sorrow, hoping to find some sort of redemption in the telling of her story. Each former member of the Manson family carried a burden, a weight that would never fully lift. They had lived in the shadow of Manson's influence, and even as they tried to make amends, their actions were forever tied to the violence they had committed. The toll of those murders, those lives lost, could not be undone by years of penitence. And yet, despite their remorse, the fear that Manson had instilled in them never truly went away. For many, their journey to redemption felt like an endless battle, a struggle to reclaim their humanity from the clutches of the man who had stripped it from them. Manson, for his part, never showed remorse. Even in his final years, his words remained as twisted as ever. He still spoke of the coming helter-skelter, still believed in the race war he had predicted decades earlier. His delusions were now entrenched in his very being, and he clung to them like a life raft in a stormy sea. But for all his bravado, for all his manipulation and power, Manson's end came quietly. His death in 2017 marked the final chapter of his life, but the effects of his actions continued to ripple through time. Though Manson was gone, the myth of the Manson family persisted. The house where the murders took place, the ranch in the hills of Los Angeles, the haunting images of Manson and his followers all remained embedded in the public consciousness. It was a reminder that even in the most peaceful of times, darkness could lurk beneath the surface, waiting to take root. And in the case of Charles Manson, that darkness had not only taken root, but had grown into something monstrous, a twisted ideology that had consumed the lives of many. The Manson family murders were not just a tragic chapter in history, they were a warning. A warning about the dangers of blind obedience, the power of manipulation, and the ease with which people can be led into darkness. Manson's ability to prey on the vulnerable to shape their minds and beliefs served as a chilling reminder that even in a world filled with light, shadows can emerge, and those shadows can take on a life of their own. Even now, decades after the murders, the story of the Manson family serves as a grim reminder of the destructive power of a single individual. The case continues to be studied, dissected, and explored as people attempt to understand how it could have happened, how one man could have led so many down such a dark path. The world may have moved on from the crimes of the Manson family, but the questions they left behind linger unanswered. Why did they do it? What was it that made them follow him so blindly? What was it about Manson that made his words seem like gospel, even when they led to death and destruction? As the years roll by, the truth may never fully be known. But the legacy of the Manson family and the horror they unleashed will continue to haunt those who are willing to listen to the whispers of the past and to learn the lessons of a dark, disturbing chapter in history. As the night deepens and the shadows stretch, let your thoughts drift into the quiet. The world outside may seem peaceful now, but remember that the darkness we sometimes see in others can echo through time long after the voices that started it have gone silent. As time passed, the Manson family's twisted story slowly faded into history, but its legacy continued to haunt. The fear that had gripped the public in the aftermath of the murders never entirely disappeared. While Manson's death in 2017 marked the physical end of the man who had orchestrated it, all his influence on popular culture, criminal psychology, and societal fears endured long after. The question of how Manson had manipulated so many into committing such heinous acts remained unanswered in the public mind. What was it about his personality, his rhetoric, and his vision that allowed him to convince young, impressionable individuals to carry out murders with such cold detachment? Even after years of interviews, documentaries, and psychological studies, the full extent of his hold over his followers was still a puzzle, one that was as terrifying as it was incomprehensible. One thing, however, became increasingly clear over time. Manson had tapped into a primal human need for belonging. His followers, many of whom were lost souls searching for purpose or family, had seen in him a guiding figure, someone who could give them a sense of direction in a chaotic world. And it wasn't just that they were vulnerable. Manson was a master at exploiting those vulnerabilities. He gave them not only a sense of belonging, but also a distorted vision of the future one that promised power and meaning. They were willing to follow him to the ends of the earth, all for the promise of something greater. The psychological manipulation he employed was chillingly effective. Manson didn't just preach about violence. He told his followers that violence was a tool for change, for cleansing the world of its impurities. He convinced them that the murder of innocent people wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was part of a grand plan, a way to bring about a new world order. For some, it was the promise of power. For others, it was the promise of love. But all were united by one common thread, the belief in Manson's vision, no matter how twisted it was. And it was that belief that turned ordinary people into killers. The Manson family murders, with their senseless brutality, became the ultimate proof of the danger of unchecked charisma and the human capacity for violence when guided by the right, or rather the wrong, leader. Yet even as the years passed and Manson's once fervent following began to fade into the annals of history, the fear of his influence remained. There were still those who believed that Manson's ideology had never truly died, that his followers, though behind bars, still carried the seeds of his madness. The question persisted. Could it happen again? As society wrestled with the legacy of Manson and his family, there was a growing awareness of the power that leaders, whether they be political, religious, or otherwise, could wield over their followers. Manson's ability to manipulate and control was no longer seen as an isolated case, but as a chilling reminder of the psychological dangers that could arise when a leader knew how to exploit the weaknesses of others. In a world full of uncertainty and division, the fear of another figure like Manson taking control was not so far-fetched. And so even as the Manson family murders grew more distant in time, the lessons they left behind were still relevant, still haunting. They were a stark reminder that the line between trust and blind obedience was a thin one. And once crossed, it could lead to a world of darkness, a world where the power of one individual could send entire lives spiraling into chaos and death. The fascination with Manson and the lasting legacy of his family's crimes only seemed to grow with each passing year. Documentaries, books, and films about the Manson family continued to flood the market, feeding the public's insatiable need to understand what had happened, what had driven those individuals to kill. In many ways, the fascination was as morbid as it was intense a way to confront a darkness that many hoped never to see again. But the deeper the world dug into Manson's story, the more questions remained unanswered. How could one man's words have had so much power? How could he bend the minds of others to his will so completely, so utterly? Was it just the force of his personality? Or was there something more insidious at play? Perhaps the truth was that we would never truly know. Some mysteries, especially those rooted in the darkest recesses of the human mind, are simply too complex to unravel. But as the world moved on, one thing remained certain. The Manson family murders would always stand as a testament to the dangers of unchecked power manipulation and the horrifying consequences of one man's vision of a world reshaped by violence. And in the stillness of the night, when the world falls quiet, the whispers of that dark chapter in history can still be heard, a reminder that sometimes the most chilling horrors come not from the supernatural, but from the very human capacity for evil. As the night deepens and the silence of the world settles around you, remember that true evil often wears the mask of something far more ordinary, far more persuasive. It creeps in when we least expect it, hiding in the most familiar places. And as the darkness lingers, so too do the echoes of those who once walked the earth, leaving behind a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions. The Manson family murders were more than just a series of horrific killings. They were a psychological study in how fear, charisma, and control could be wielded by one person to influence and destroy the lives of many. As the decades passed, the story continued to haunt both the public and those who had been caught in Manson's orbit. Yet the mystery of how someone could manipulate others to commit such unspeakable acts remained an enigma, one that we still struggle to understand fully. Charles Manson's ability to prey on his followers' insecurities, desires, and vulnerabilities was a chilling testament to his control. He wasn't just a figure of authority in their eyes. He became a god, an all-powerful being who dictated their thoughts, actions, and beliefs. His followers believed that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that transcended the mundanity of daily life. They believed that they had a purpose, one that would give their lives meaning, no matter what it cost. And as time went on, the question that lingered over the entire Manson family saga was whether they truly understood the magnitude of the crimes they committed. For some, it seemed clear that they had no idea what they were getting into, that they were simply following orders from a man who had preyed upon their vulnerabilities. But for others, the lines were more blurred. The deeper they were drawn into Manson's web, the harder it became to see where their own responsibility began and ended. For years, the survivors of the Manson family, those who had been manipulated into carrying out the murders, but later turned against him, have tried to grapple with the horror of their involvement. They spent years in prison, serving their time. But could they ever truly atone for the blood they had spilled? Could they ever fully escape the shadow of the darkness Manson had placed them under? Many of them carried the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives, struggling to find peace in the wake of the violence they had committed. The psychological toll of their actions was immense, but so too was the emotional turmoil of being part of something that had promised love and belonging, but had turned into a nightmarish cult. It was hard for the world to reconcile these individuals, the young, impressionable followers, with the brutal killers they had become. The psychological transformation that took place within them was deeply unsettling, a stark reminder of how malleable the human mind could be when subjected to manipulation. In the years after their convictions, some of Manson's followers attempted to break free from his influence. They sought redemption publicly, disavowing Manson's teachings and trying to make amends for the suffering they had caused. But the scars of the past remained etched deeply into their psyches. For them, there would never be a true escape. Every day was a struggle with the ghosts of their past, haunted not just by the victims, but by their own participation in the violence. No matter how much they tried to rebuild their lives, the guilt never fully went away. The truth was that Manson had created a world of delusion. In his twisted vision, violence was not only justified, it was necessary. It wasn't just about murder, it was about control. Manson didn't just want his followers to commit violence. He wanted to strip them of their identity, to erase any sense of personal morality or agency, and replace it with obedience to his commands. In doing so, he forged a cult of willing killers, each one convinced that they were part of a higher calling. But what happens when that world shatters? When the spell is broken, and the followers are left to confront the blood on their hands? The lies that were told to them, and the atrocities they helped commit. The journey toward redemption for many of them was a long and painful one. Some found a degree of peace, though the memories never fully faded. Others were consumed by guilt and regret, their lives forever marked by their past actions. As Manson's death marked the end of an era, it also opened a new chapter of reflection. The Manson family was gone, but the echoes of their crimes reverberated through the culture. New generations would come to learn about the horrors they had unleashed, and each would ask the same questions. How could this have happened? What made them follow him? And more importantly, could it happen again? Though Manson's death had closed a chapter, it also served as a reminder of the dangers that could arise from unchecked influence and manipulation. In a world still struggling with division and fear, the Manson family murders stood as a grim warning of the psychological power one person could wield over others. It wasn't just a story about crime, it was a story about the human mind, its weaknesses, and its capacity to both deceive and be deceived. In the years that followed, the legacy of the Manson family continued to shape public discussions about cults, brainwashing, and the fine line between influence and control. The case remained an unsettling reminder of the fragility of the human mind in the face of a charismatic leader, and of the dangers that lurked when individuals became willing to give up their free will for the promise of belonging. As the darkness of the past slowly receded, there remained one truth that couldn't be denied. The Manson family murders were not just about violence. They were about the power of belief and the ways in which that belief could be twisted into something far darker than anyone could ever have imagined. The night seems to stretch on forever, the silence of the world around you, like a cloak, heavy and suffocating. And as your mind drifts, you realize that sometimes the greatest horror lies not in the things we can see, but in the unseen forces that shape our thoughts and guide our actions. The whispers of the past remain always lingering just at the edge of consciousness, reminding us that the darkness can always return in ways we least expect. Though Manson had died, the reverberations of his crimes continued to cast a long shadow, reaching far beyond the cold walls of prison and the fading headlines of his trial. For some, Manson's death didn't signal an end to his influence. It was merely a reminder of how deep his control had run, how powerful his legacy was in shaping the history of cults, manipulation, and the human psyche. The Manson family murders had left an indelible mark on American society, but even more so on the cultural landscape of fear and fascination that bloomed in the years following. The idea that one man could manipulate so many, convincing them to carry out such grotesque acts, continued to be an eerie reminder of the fragility of human reasoning and the dangers of unchecked power. For those who had been involved, the past was never fully buried. Their guilt, their regret was a heavy cloak they carried for the rest of their lives. But for the world at large, the story of the Manson family was one of myth and legend, a cautionary tale whispered in dark corners. It was a chilling example of how vulnerability, fear, and hope could be exploited by a master manipulator, someone who promised salvation while leading them to a road paved with blood. The trials were long over the survivors, and the convicted serving their time or attempting to find redemption. Yet, even decades later, questions persisted. Were they truly victims of Manson's manipulation, or were they simply complicit in their own actions? How many of them had been too deeply entangled in his vision to fully recognize the horror of their deeds? And perhaps most unsettling of all, could something like this ever happen again? Manson's own words continued to haunt, still echoing in the back of the public's mind, helter-skelter. The phrase had come to symbolize not just a race war, as Manson had predicted, but also the chaos and destruction of a world turned upside down. It was a chilling metaphor for the madness that had spread like wildfire, infecting the minds of the Manson family, pushing them to commit acts of unimaginable violence in the name of a twisted cause. As documentaries, books, and interviews with former Manson family members continued to surface, it became clear that the full depth of the manipulation had been far more insidious than initially thought. Manson had preyed upon those who were vulnerable, searching for meaning in a chaotic world. He had convinced them that he alone held the answers, that his vision was the only truth worth following. Yet behind the stories of bloodshed and terror, there were the human beings once just like anyone else, searching for purpose, for love, for belonging. How easy it had been for Manson to deceive them, to convince them that violence was not just acceptable, but necessary, all under the guise of spiritual awakening and revolution. The haunting aspect of Manson's power was not simply that he was a manipulator, but that he had created a world in which his followers believed their actions were justified. They believed they were doing the right thing. And it was this conviction, this twisted sense of righteousness, that made their crimes even more terrifying. They were not simply carrying out orders, they were fulfilling a prophecy, a cause they had been indoctrinated into, one that was as terrifying as it was delusional. As the years turned into decades, the world moved on, but the shadow of the Manson family remained. In interviews and articles, psychologists and criminologists continued to study the case, attempting to understand what made Manson such a compelling figure. How had he manipulated not just a few, but an entire group of people? Was it his words, his gaze, his understanding of human nature? Or was there something more sinister at play? Something more ingrained in the collective psyche of those who followed him? For many, the case of the Manson family was a study in the fragility of the human mind, in the ways that extreme circumstances could warp an individual's perception of reality. It was a story of idealism turned dark, of hope transformed into horror. Manson had offered his followers a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose in an uncertain world. But in doing so, he had led them down a path that would forever mar their souls. As new generations learned of the Manson family's story, it was often told with a sense of morbid fascination. The images of Manson's disheveled, wild-eyed face, the haunting stories of the murders, and the chilling remnants of his legacy became a part of the cultural fabric. And with it, the fear remained that a similar figure could rise again, that there could be someone out there capable of pulling the strings of the vulnerable, convincing them to do unspeakable things. But even as society tried to move past the dark legacy of Manson, the truth remained. The human mind is both resilient and fragile, and there is no guarantee that the horrors of the past cannot be repeated. What had happened in the 1960s under the spell of Charles Manson was a stark reminder of how quickly a society could slip into chaos when one voice had the power to dominate, to manipulate, and to destroy. As for Manson's followers, many continued to live with the weight of their actions. Some found a way to rebuild their lives, though their past would never fully let them go. Others remained in the shadows, their stories untold, their guilt too great to bear. But for all of them, Manson's legacy was one they could never escape. As the night grows deeper, let your thoughts wander, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones we can see, but the ones who lurk in the corners of our minds, waiting for the right moment to take control. The passage of time has a way of eroding the sharp edges of history, but some stories, no matter how long ago they were written, refuse to fade. The Manson family murders, despite being decades in the past, remain a constant shadow lingering in the collective memory. It's as though the haunting imagery of those days never fully dissipated, like a storm cloud that never quite moves on, always hanging just on the horizon of our awareness. In the years following Manson's death, a peculiar fascination with his crimes continued to thrive. Documentaries, films and books about the Manson family surged in popularity. But why? Why did the world continue to return to a tragedy so dark, so chilling, so utterly incomprehensible? The answer might lie in the very essence of what Manson had done. His crimes were not just acts of violence, they were symbolic. They represented the corruption of something pure. The idea that the power of one person could so thoroughly distort the lives of others was a concept that terrified people on a fundamental level. Manson wasn't just a criminal, he was an embodiment of the dangers of unchecked influence. He was the living example of how words could be twisted into something malignant, how a single charismatic figure could sow chaos in a society that seemed on the surface to be flourishing. He preyed on the vulnerable, on those searching for answers in a world that seemed to offer none. He offered them certainty, a sense of purpose, and in exchange, they gave him their loyalty, their souls, and ultimately, their humanity. The story of the Manson family is more than just about murder. It's about the fragility of belief. It's about how easily people can be led astray when they are desperate, when they are in pain, when they feel alone. And it's about how the human psyche, when broken down and manipulated, can justify the most atrocious of acts. This is the core of Manson's power, his ability to exploit the emotional and psychological vulnerabilities of those around him. As the years went by, some of Manson's followers were released from prison, having served their sentences. But the question always lingered. Could they ever truly escape their past? Could they ever be absolved of the horrors they had helped commit? Redemption for many of them was a lifelong struggle, a battle with guilt, shame, and the unrelenting memories of their involvement in the murders. It was a prison they could never truly escape, no matter how much time had passed. For the rest of their lives, the stain of their actions would remain. Many of them, like Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel, tried to express regret for what they had done. They sought to atone, hoping that their remorse would somehow cleanse them of their past. Some spoke publicly about their experiences, attempting to show the world that they had learned from their mistakes. But how does one atone for taking a life, for taking multiple lives? How does one find peace when their hands have been stained with blood, even if that blood was shed under the influence of a delusional, manipulative figure? For the world, the trials of Manson's followers became just as gripping as the murders themselves. The public fascination with Manson's followers, who they were, how they got involved, and what drove them to kill, only deepened over time. They were no longer seen merely as mindless killers, but as victims in their own right, albeit victims who had inflicted unspeakable pain on others. Yet, in all the media frenzy and cultural fascination with the Manson family, one simple truth remained buried. The human capacity for evil is not limited to the past. Manson was not an anomaly. He was a reflection of a much deeper human condition, one that in the right circumstances can turn normal people into monsters. The Manson family murders were not a singular event. In time, they were a microcosm of a larger, more terrifying idea. That one person with enough influence can convince others to abandon all sense of morality and participate in violence. In the years after the trials, as the world turned its attention to new scandals, new crimes, the Manson family murders remained a constant reminder. They were a warning that in any given moment, any of us could be susceptible to manipulation, to being drawn into a belief system that, though it might promise us something greater, ultimately demands everything from us in return. The allure of belonging, the need to be part of something bigger than ourselves, is a powerful force. Manson had exploited that force to its darkest extreme. And that was the true horror, the fact that it could happen again. As the years passed, the danger of Manson's legacy was not in his death, but in the ever-present possibility that someone else somewhere could rise with the same kind of influence, the same kind of charisma. The human mind, after all, is still vulnerable. Manson's story is a stark reminder that even in a world that seems far more advanced, far more enlightened than the 1960s, the darkness that he unleashed could rise again. The questions surrounding the Manson family are still unanswered in many ways. Why did they follow him so blindly? Why did they commit such horrendous acts in his name? And most importantly, could it happen again? These questions haunt us, remain unanswered in the cold silence of history, leaving a legacy that refuses to be forgotten. As you drift into sleep tonight, consider how fragile our perceptions of reality truly are. The world may seem peaceful on the surface, but deep down, there are forces both within and outside of us that can shape our beliefs and actions in ways we never imagined. The Manson family murders, despite the years that had passed, continue to cast their long shadow over history, leaving behind more questions than answers. While Manson's death marked the final chapter for him, it didn't bring an end to the legacy of fear and fascination that surrounded his name. The Manson family murders became in many ways a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of the power of manipulation and the fragility of the human mind. There were those who sought to understand how Manson had pulled so many into his web, and how they had, without question, followed his every command. Manson's charisma, his ability to exploit the deepest fears and desires of his followers, became the focal point of countless studies on the psychology of cults. How had he turned ordinary people into cold-blooded killers? How had he convinced them that murder was not only acceptable, but necessary? These questions would continue to haunt psychologists, criminologists, and even casual observers for years to come. Some had tried to explain Manson's influence as a result of his magnetic personality, his skillful rhetoric, and the hypnotic pull of his beliefs. Others pointed to the cultural and political climate of the time, the social unrest, the disillusionment with the establishment, the growing counterculture that made it easier for Manson to find a receptive audience. But at the core, the true horror was not just in what Manson did, but in how easily others were manipulated. He wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man who understood how to prey on the vulnerable. He was a man who saw a world in chaos and used that chaos as a means to control others. In the years that followed, as survivors of the Manson family tried to make amends for their past, the legacy of their actions remained. Some found solace in public apologies. Others spent their lives in prison, but none could escape the haunting memories of what they had done. For many, there was no redemption. The blood that had been spilled could never truly be washed away, and their connection to Manson could never be undone. They had participated in something so grotesque that the weight of it was carried with them for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Manson family story was the way it revealed the potential for evil that can exist within anyone. Manson was not a supernatural force. He was a man. He was able to persuade, manipulate, and convince people to carry out horrific acts simply because he had found the right vulnerabilities. His followers weren't mindless robots. They were individuals who were searching for meaning, for belonging, and for a sense of purpose in a fractured world. And Manson gave that to them, at a price. The human desire to belong, to be a part of something greater than oneself, is a powerful force. It can drive people to do incredible things, both good and bad. In the case of the Manson family, the desire drove them to the darkest depths of human nature. They believed in Manson's vision his twisted interpretation of the world, and in doing so, they lost themselves in his delusions. The story of the Manson family became a symbol of the dangers of charismatic leadership, of the ways in which people can be influenced to commit unimaginable acts in the name of a cause. It wasn't just a story about crime. It was a story about human nature, about the power of belief and the ways in which individuals can be made to see the world through the eyes of another, no matter how warped that perspective may be. And yet, even as society tried to move on, the Manson family's legacy lingered in the background, a dark specter that would never be fully exorcised. There were still those who idolized Manson still, those who believed that his vision of a chaotic apocalyptic world had been right all along. His influence continued to be felt even in death as the myth of Manson grew and evolved, taking on a life of its own in the world of true crime, pop culture, and social discourse. But as time wore on, the story of the Manson family slowly became something more. It was no longer just a tale of murder and madness. It became a part of the collective memory, a lesson to be learned. It was a story that reminded us of the importance of questioning authority, of recognizing the signs of manipulation, and of understanding how easily the human mind can be swayed when it is vulnerable and searching for answers. The Manson family murders are a part of history now, and while the faces of those involved may fade, the impact of their actions continues to be felt. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the darkest evil doesn't come from what we can see, but from the manipulation of the mind. It's a reminder that we must always be vigilant, that we must never let ourselves be consumed by another person's vision, no matter how compelling it may seem. As you settle into the quiet of the night, remember this darkness can take many forms. It can come in the guise of a leader, a voice that promises salvation, but leads only to destruction. It can creep in through the cracks in our minds, exploiting our fears, our desires, and our need for connection. It can twist our perception of reality until the line between good and evil becomes blurred, until we no longer know where we end and the darkness begins. The story of the Manson family is one that we should never forget. It is not just a tale of murder. It is a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of influence, manipulation, and blind obedience. And as long as we remember it, we can only hope that the lessons learned from it will help prevent such horrors from ever happening again. As the years continued to pass, the Manson family murders remained deeply woven into the fabric of American history. Their story was explored and revisited time and time again, each generation finding new meanings and new lessons within the tragic events of that summer. But with each retelling, a dark reality remained. It was not just the horrific murders that lingered, but the psychological devastation left behind. It was the way in which those innocent, vulnerable minds had been twisted into tools of violence. While many believed that the influence of Manson and his followers had faded into the past, the truth was that his legacy endured. It wasn't just the survivors and the family members who felt the weight of what had happened. It was the very culture in which those events occurred, an era of social upheaval and political change, a time when the world was shifting beneath the feet of many. The 1960s, filled with counterculture movements and idealism, had been a fertile ground for manipulation, and Manson had exploited that vulnerability. Manson had presented his followers with a distorted, apocalyptic vision of the future, one in which chaos and violence were justified as part of a cosmic order. And for a time, his followers believed in that vision, with their whole beings convincing themselves that they were acting for a greater purpose. The murders they committed were not seen as mere acts of brutality, but as a form of spiritual cleansing, a revolution that would change the world. But in the aftermath, it became clear that there was no greater purpose to the violence. There was only loss. The victims, Sharon Tate, her friends, and the LaBiancas, were innocent lives taken too soon, caught in the madness of someone else's delusions. Their families were left to mourn their worlds shattered in an instant. The pain of their loss was an ache that could never truly heal. As for Manson and his followers, their lives too were destroyed. Though they were convicted and sentenced, the psychological scars they carried remained gnawing at them even as they tried to atone for their crimes. Some had come to realize the depth of their manipulation, the horrific role they had played in the killings. But could they ever forgive themselves? Could the remorse they felt truly erase the blood on their hands? The answer, as it often is in such cases, was unclear. Redemption was an elusive concept for those who had lived through the horror of Manson's influence. Even as they sought to reconcile their actions, their past could never be fully erased. They were forever tied to the darkness of the Manson family murders, and no amount of public apology could undo the damage they had caused. But, in some ways, that was the price of Manson's manipulation, the destruction of everyone involved. Those who had followed him, those who had killed in his name, were left to live with the consequences of their actions, haunted by the lives they had taken, by the horror they had been part of. For the world, the Manson family murders became a stark reminder of the dangers of cults of leaders who prey on the vulnerable and of the horrifying potential of psychological manipulation. The lessons learned from that chapter in history were valuable ones. Trust must be earned, not blindly given. Questions should always be asked, and authority should never be followed without doubt. As the decades passed, the fascination with Manson never fully waned. His story was told and retold, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the psychological complexities they revealed. How had Manson become such a figure of influence? What had drawn so many to him? And perhaps, most chillingly, how easy had it been for them to cross the line between right and wrong, between morality and madness? Though Manson had died, his story continued to fascinate and disturb. The face of the murderer, wild-eyed and filled with conviction, remained an indelible image in the collective memory. But beneath the surface, the true horror was not just the bloodshed. It was the understanding that human beings, when vulnerable and desperate for connection, could be manipulated into doing unspeakable things. Manson had not just preyed on his followers' weaknesses. He had preyed on their very need for meaning, in a world that often seemed senseless and chaotic. In doing so, he had woven a web of destruction, and those caught in it would never be the same. And so, as the world moves on, as new generations come of age and learn the story of the Manson family, the lessons from that dark time remain clear. The darkness Manson unleashed wasn't just confined to his time or his followers. It was a darkness that still lurked in the corners of the human psyche. And if we're not careful, it could always return. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all, the lingering sense of fear that the same story could repeat itself, that another charismatic figure, another master manipulator could rise up and lead others down the same twisted path. The Manson family's story was not just a tale of murders, it was a tale of humanity's susceptibility to the darkest forces within us. And as we move forward, we must remain vigilant, never forgetting the lessons of the past. As the stillness of the night wraps around you, take a moment to reflect. We often look to the past for answers, for lessons, and for comfort. But sometimes the truth lies in the fragility of the human mind, and in how easily it can be swayed by those who understand its weaknesses. In the quiet darkness of the night, as the world outside settles into its natural rhythm, the story of the Manson family remains an unsettling reminder of what can happen when vulnerability meets the power of manipulation. The chilling reality of the Manson family murders still haunts, not because of the brutality alone, but because of the insidious nature of the control that Charles Manson exerted over his followers. It was a power that went beyond mere persuasion. It was a force that redefined their very sense of self, distorting their values, their morals, and their reality. Over the years, as more was uncovered about Manson and his followers, the narrative began to shift. No longer were they simply viewed as cold-blooded killers. They were seen as victims in their own right, victims of Manson's psychological control. This idea brought with it a complex layer of horror. Manson didn't just use physical violence to get what he wanted. He used the very minds of his followers. He planted seeds of doubt, fear, and paranoia, convincing them that they were part of something greater, something that justified the most heinous acts. And with each seed he planted, he watched his followers lose themselves, relinquishing their free will in the process. Manson's grip on his followers was so absolute that it seemed almost impossible that they had been capable of thinking for themselves. The very people who had once held hope for a better world, for a more meaningful existence, were transformed into instruments of destruction. The violence they perpetrated, the blood they spilled, was no longer an act of individual choice. It was a manifestation of Manson's delusional vision, a vision he had twisted into a nightmare. For years, Manson's followers tried to make sense of what had happened. Many of them found themselves lost in a world they no longer understood, a world where their actions could not be reconciled with their own moral compass. The weight of their crimes, the brutal murders they had committed, would haunt them forever. Some would spend decades in prison, slowly coming to grips with their past, trying to find a way to make peace with the lives they had taken. But could they ever atone for what they had done? Could they ever truly escape the psychological hold Manson had left behind? For those who survived, the path to redemption was never straightforward. There was no easy way to undo the damage, no simple apology that could wipe away the bloodshed. The journey was long, often agonizing, and fraught with guilt. Even if they had sought redemption, it didn't change the fact that they had been willing participants in one of the most brutal series of murders in modern history. And yet, as time wore on, the public's fascination with the Manson family murders only deepened. The media, always eager for sensational stories, continued to pore over the details, picking apart every part of Manson's life, every twist and turn of his followers' involvement. His story became something of a modern myth, a dark fable told and retold, each retelling adding new layers to the narrative, each version leaving something new to be discovered, something new to be feared. But in all the documentaries, books, and interviews, the true horror of the Manson family murders was never really fully explored. The real fear didn't lie in the murders themselves. It didn't lie in the blood or the bodies. The true horror was in the way Manson had taken control of his followers' minds. It was the terrifying ability of one man to take away the free will of others, to convince them that violence, murder, and mayhem were not just acceptable, they were necessary. What made Manson's manipulation so chilling wasn't just that he convinced a group of young, impressionable people to kill for him. It was that he made them believe they were doing something righteous, something moral, something that would bring about the helter-skelter revolution. The twisted logic that he weaved around them was so convincing, so persuasive, that they were willing to die for it. They believed they were fulfilling a higher purpose, a greater calling, and that made the horror of their actions even more profound. But in the aftermath of the murders, as the world began to understand the scope of the violence, the questions still remained. What drives someone to follow a man like Manson? What is it about the human psyche that allows it to become so easily swayed, so easily manipulated by one person's delusions? These were the questions that the world could never fully answer. They lingered in the air like smoke, elusive and haunting. Even after Manson's death, his story continued to haunt those who had lived through it, those who had witnessed the destruction it wrought. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the Manson family story was that it was not an isolated event. It was a chilling reminder of the dangers of groupthink, of how easily a community, a family, or a nation can be swayed by one person's vision. And perhaps in that truth lies the greatest terror of all, that we too could be vulnerable to such manipulation. That in the right circumstances, anyone could be led astray. Manson may have died, but his influence, his legacy, and the terrifying lessons learned from his actions lived on. The story of the Manson family murders remains an enduring cautionary tale, one that reminds us that evil doesn't always wear the face of a monster. Sometimes it wears the face of someone who understands our weaknesses and knows how to prey upon them. As the night draws to a close, the silence seems to hold a deeper meaning, a reminder that sometimes the darkest things are not the monsters we can see, but the ones that hide inside our minds. Be vigilant, be aware, and never forget, evil often comes in the most unassuming of forms. The chilling echoes of the Manson family's crimes reverberate through the years, and though the story seems to belong to the past, it remains ever present. The tragedy of Sharon Tate and the others who lost their lives that night is one that continues to haunt not just the survivors and the families left behind, but society itself. It's not just the loss of life that remains disturbing. It's the realization that such horror could come from a figure who was in many ways just like anyone else. Charles Manson, for all his insanity and delusions, was human. He wasn't born a monster. He was a man who manipulated the minds of vulnerable people, exploited their weaknesses, and led them down a dark path. This is the true terror of Manson's legacy, the realization that manipulation doesn't require an overt evil. It often comes wrapped in charisma, in false promises of belonging, and in the convincing allure of someone who knows how to prey on the loneliness and confusion of others. Manson's ability to control his followers was a horrifying case study in the psychology of influence. It's not just that he convinced them to commit murder, it's that he made them believe they were part of something greater, something important. He turned murder into a moral crusade, and once he had them under his control, they saw themselves as soldiers in a race war, their bloody actions justified by the ideology Manson had carefully crafted. But what about the survivors? The ones who had been involved in the murders, but later rejected Manson's vision. Their journey, too, was fraught with pain. The psychological toll of being involved in something so horrific could never be fully erased. They would live with the knowledge of what they had done, the lives they had taken, and the horrors they had committed in the name of a twisted cause. Could they ever truly come to terms with their actions? Could any amount of remorse undo the damage they had caused? For many of Manson's followers, the years spent in prison were years of reflection, long, painful moments of realizing the depth of their manipulation. But no matter how much time passed, they could never escape the horrors they had been part of. The scars left by Manson's influence were deep etched not just in their lives, but in the fabric of society itself. The murders weren't just a crime. They were a reflection of something much darker, a force that had been allowed to spread unchecked and had consumed the minds of people who had once been ordinary. As the survivors of the Manson family tried to find redemption, they realized that the world would never let them forget their crimes. They were forever marked by their involvement. Their names would always be associated with violence, with madness, and with the name of Charles Manson. It wasn't just the lives they took that haunted them. It was the idea that they had been manipulated, that they had lost themselves so completely to Manson's delusions. But what of the people who had never been part of the family? What of the rest of society? The Manson family murders weren't just a tragedy for the victims, they were a tragedy for everyone. They were a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with red flags. Sometimes it comes in quiet whispers, in the form of a leader who can twist truth into lies, a figure who can shape reality to fit their own warped vision. The terror is not just in the brutality of the crime, but in the fact that many were convinced that the violence was justified. The world, it seemed, would never quite be able to shake the impact of the Manson family's reign of terror. The questions would always linger. How did it happen? Why did they follow him? What could have been done to stop it before it turned into such a nightmarish reality? Despite the passage of time, there remained no clear answers. Manson had been a master manipulator, and his influence, even in death, lived on. Those who had followed him, those who had committed unspeakable acts in his name, were left to wrestle with their own culpability. The darkness of their actions was never fully washed away. Even when they tried to speak of remorse, it was always tainted by the blood on their hands. The legacy of the Manson family was not just the horror they inflicted on their victims. It was the psychological damage done to themselves and to the world that had allowed Manson to rise to power. For those who had once been part of the Manson family, the scars ran deep. But perhaps the greatest horror was the realization that their actions had been justified to them in ways that made sense in the moment, even if it was all built on lies. And in the end, what remained was the echo of Manson's voice, still reverberating in their minds, still manipulating them from the grave. And yet, even in the years that followed, there was something to be learned from the story of the Manson family. The greatest danger was not just in blind obedience, but in the ease with which people could be convinced that their actions were justified by a cause, a leader, or a vision. It was a lesson in vulnerability in the darkness that can emerge when we let our guard down, when we allow someone else to dictate our beliefs, our morals, and our actions. In the end, Manson's story was not just a tragic one, it was a warning. It was a reminder that evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. It can come in the form of a man who preys on the weak, who convinces others to commit unspeakable acts in the name of a distorted cause. And when that happens, the world becomes a darker place, one where the line between right and wrong becomes blurry, and the consequences of our actions can never truly be undone. As the night settles around you, think on this: we all have the capacity to be influenced, to be led astray. In a world that often feels divided, uncertain, it's important to stay vigilant, to ask questions, to seek truth, and to guard against the dangers of blind loyalty. The story of the Manson family is a cautionary tale, one that will continue to haunt us for generations to come. The world's fascination with the Manson family has remained long after Manson's death, as a chilling reflection of the human tendency to seek meaning in times of uncertainty. The history of this tragedy serves as a stark reminder that evil can emerge in ways we least expect, through words, ideas, and ideologies, more than through acts of violence alone. The Manson family murders weren't merely the product of a deranged man, but of a combination of societal, psychological, and cultural factors that made such a tragedy possible. While the crimes themselves are unimaginable in their brutality, it is the psychological mechanisms that made them possible that are most terrifying. Charles Manson didn't just rely on force or intimidation. He understood the human mind and its weaknesses. He preyed on the vulnerable, the disillusioned youth, the lonely, the lost. His manipulation wasn't just physical, it was cerebral, exploiting the trust and need for purpose that his followers so desperately craved. Manson, in his warped way, had given them a sense of belonging, a place where they could feel like they mattered. To his followers, he was not just a leader, but a father figure, a spiritual guide, a savior. They believed in him, in his vision, in the power of the revolution he promised. They convinced themselves that the murders they committed were not senseless violence, but an essential part of the apocalyptic war Manson had foretold. They were fighting for the future, even as they destroyed lives in the present. The tragedy, of course, is that they were completely blinded by Manson's delusion, so deeply lost in his version of reality that they couldn't recognize the monster they were becoming. But even as Manson's death drew closer, the legacy of the Manson family continued to cast its long, dark shadow. Some of the survivors found their way out of the nightmare. They publicly denounced Manson and expressed remorse for their involvement in the murders, but redemption was elusive. They could never fully escape the horrifying reality of what they had done. The sense of guilt and regret was a permanent fixture in their lives, just as much a part of them as the memories of Manson's influence. For those still alive, there remained a sense of responsibility, not just for the lives they had taken, but for the lives they had ruined. The psychological damage inflicted by Manson, the way he had dismantled their understanding of morality and purpose, had consequences that lasted a lifetime. Could they ever find peace knowing that their actions had been part of a larger, more destructive force? Could they ever erase the imprint of Manson's madness from their minds? The questions never stopped haunting those who had been involved in the Manson family's crimes. They were trapped in the aftermath of a horror they could never fully come to terms with. And yet the most unsettling part of the story remained the fact that despite their regret, they had still allowed themselves to follow Manson's words. They had believed him. They had trusted him. And that blind trust had led them down a dark path. As time passed, the Manson family's legacy continued to be dissected in books, documentaries, and films. But the true horror of their story was more than just the gruesome murders. It was the psychological manipulation that made those murders possible. Manson had not just broken the law, he had broken the minds of those who followed him. His crimes were not simply about violence, they were about control, about bending people's wills and reshaping their realities. Manson was able to make his followers believe that they were justified in their actions, that the killings were part of some greater mission. And that belief, that warped sense of right and wrong, is what made his manipulation so terrifying. While many moved on from the story, the questions still remained. What would drive someone to follow a figure like Manson? Was it weakness, or was it a desire for something more? Something Manson promised, but could never truly deliver. And if one man could sway, so many. Could it happen again? Could another leader with the same type of persuasive power rise and take control of a new group of lost souls? The possibilities were frightening, and they lingered unsettlingly in the minds of those who had followed the case for years. The world had seen the results of Manson's influence, and it couldn't help but wonder How often does this happen without us realizing it? How many other figures, even today, play upon the same fears and insecurities, the same sense of longing for belonging to manipulate people into doing their bidding? Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Manson family story, not just the bloodshed, but the psychological lessons it left behind. It was a warning, a reminder to always be vigilant in the face of manipulation, to recognize the signs of someone trying to control your thoughts, your beliefs, and your actions. The story of Charles Manson is not just a historical horror story. It's an ongoing cautionary tale about the dangers of blind loyalty, of believing in something so strongly that you lose your sense of self in the process. As you lay down to sleep tonight, remember this: in the quietest moments, the most dangerous forces often go unnoticed. It's not always the loudest, most obvious threats that cause the most harm. It's the whispers, the manipulations, the slow shifts in reality that go unnoticed until it's too late. The world is full of people, ideas, and ideologies that prey on our fears and our desires, and we must remain aware of them. The Manson family murders are just one example of how such forces can manifest in the most terrifying ways. But they are also a reminder that we must stay vigilant, questioning the world around us, and guarding against the darkness that can so easily take root in a human heart. The story of the Manson family is a dark, labyrinthine tale that intertwines tragedy, manipulation, and a deep, unsettling psychological horror. As the decades pass, its impact doesn't wane. If anything, it grows more terrifying with each retelling, partially because we now live in a world where Manson's manipulation feels less like an anomaly and more like a cautionary tale for the future. The world has changed in countless ways since Manson's trial, but the question remains: how did we as a society allow such a thing to happen? The answer is complex, multifaceted, and disturbing. Manson did not just build a following through violence or fear. He capitalized on the underlying currents of societal unrest, on the same disillusionment that ran through the veins of many young people in the 1960s. He didn't need to force people into his ideology. He simply met them where they were, played on their emotions, and gave them a cause, a reason to live, even if that cause was built on a foundation of lies and insanity. It was Manson's ability to exploit the fragility of the human psyche that makes his story so horrifying. He gave his followers something that seemed to be missing from their lives: a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, a belief that they were part of something greater. He preyed upon the universal human need to feel valued, to have a place in the world, to believe in something bigger than oneself. And while Manson's vision was twisted, it was compelling enough to transform ordinary, impressionable individuals into killers, each one willing to sacrifice their morality, their sense of self, and ultimately, their humanity. Manson's manipulation wasn't just about controlling his followers' actions, it was about controlling their perceptions of reality. He created a false narrative, one where the world was divided into those who were awake and those who were asleep. He convinced them that the helter-skelter revolution was coming, a war of races that would cleanse the world, leaving only his chosen few to rise from the ashes. But this wasn't just some apocalyptic fantasy. It was Manson's way of justifying the violence that he would ultimately encourage them to commit. They believed they were fulfilling a higher purpose, serving a greater good, when in reality they were simply pawns in Manson's delusional game. The murders they committed in 1969 were not the actions of people who were cold and calculating. They were the actions of individuals who had been brainwashed, whose sense of right and wrong had been distorted beyond recognition. What made the Manson family murders so deeply chilling was not just the brutality of the killings, but the fact that the murderers believed they were doing the right thing. They thought they were carrying out a divine mandate. For those who survived the nightmare, the years that followed were filled with deep, unrelenting guilt. They couldn't escape the question that haunted them. How could we have let it happen? How could they have fallen under Manson's spell, done the things they did, and then later try to justify their actions with the excuse of following orders or believing in the cause? As the years went on, many of Manson's former followers turned to public apologies, speaking out about their regret, their remorse, and their journey toward redemption. But could anyone truly redeem themselves after taking lives in such a senseless, brutal way? Could they ever truly escape the ghosts of their past? Perhaps more disturbing than the question of redemption was the realization that Manson's manipulation wasn't something unique to him, it was something that could happen again. The same psychological vulnerabilities that Manson exploited in his followers still exist in society today. People are still searching for meaning, for belonging, for a cause. And there will always be those willing to offer a vision, no matter how warped, that promises to fill that void. The ability to manipulate people into committing atrocities is not confined to the past. It is a power that can rise again in new forms under new leaders with new ideologies. As the world watches with growing horror, as the tides of extremism and radicalization continue to rise in many parts of the world, it's impossible not to draw parallels to the story of Manson and his followers. We are living in an age where misinformation spreads faster than ever, where social isolation is a growing epidemic, and where people are increasingly drawn to the promise of belonging and certainty in an increasingly uncertain world. The conditions that allowed Manson's influence to flourish are still present today, lurking beneath the surface of society, waiting to be exploited. Manson may be dead, but the lessons of the Manson family murders remain as relevant as ever. The true horror is not just in what happened, but in what could still happen. The ability of one person to seize control of another's mind, to twist their beliefs, and to push them into violent action is a terrifying reminder of how fragile our sense of self can be, and how easily it can be broken. Even now, we are left to wonder, how do we protect ourselves from the Manson-like figures who still walk among us? How do we ensure that we do not fall prey to the seductive promises of those who would manipulate us, distort our realities, and push us into darkness? The Manson family murders, though a tragedy in their most horrific form, have also become a warning one that we must carry with us. It is a warning about the vulnerability of the human mind and the importance of questioning authority, of being aware of how easy it is to be led astray. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps think on this. There is a certain danger in blindly following a leader, in surrendering your thoughts and actions to someone else. The mind is a fragile thing, and it can be twisted in ways we never thought possible. But if we stay aware, if we continue to ask questions and trust our own judgment, we can resist the darkness that seeks to lead us astray. Despite the passing of decades since the Manson family murders, the dark imprint left on history continues to provoke unsettling reflection. As much as we may hope that time would lessen the impact, the chilling reality remains. The Manson family wasn't just a group of lost souls that followed an evil man. It was an example of how far humans can fall when psychological manipulation is at its peak. Manson's ability to distort reality, to twist minds, continues to serve as a stark reminder of how easily people can be led into darkness. In the years after Manson's death, the world has faced a myriad of societal changes, yet his influence remains a timeless warning. As humanity progresses, Manson's legacy lurks in the background of every story about manipulation, every tale of extremism, and every report of charismatic figures leading others to commit terrible acts in the name of an ideal. As we look back on the Manson family, it's easy to say, it could never happen again. But could it? Is it possible that in the chaos of modern times when people are searching for meaning, for purpose, and for identity, a figure like Manson could rise again? The fear lies not just in the murders, but in the realization that Manson's hold over his followers wasn't supernatural, it was psychological. It was built on exploiting human desires, vulnerabilities, and fears, and this is where the true horror lies. Manson wasn't an anomaly. He was a man with flaws, weaknesses, and a sick vision, who managed to manipulate a group of people into committing crimes so horrific that they still haunt us today. The vulnerability he exploited wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual, psychological, and societal. Manson gave his followers a cause to live and die for something that promised purpose, when everything else in their lives seemed uncertain. That promise of belonging, of something greater than themselves, was a powerful motivator. But Manson's vision was always destructive. He told his followers that violence was the means to an end, and for a time they believed him. He wrapped murder in the guise of revolution, making them believe that they were part of something world-changing, when in fact they were simply pawns in his twisted game. While society has learned a great deal from Manson's story, it's impossible to ignore the disturbing reality that his method of manipulation could rise again in the future. Leaders who promise certainty in uncertain times, who tap into fear and use it to control, still exist today. The power of charisma remains an intoxicating force, one that in the wrong hands can lead to devastation. The Manson family murders are a reminder of how susceptible we all are to influence, especially in times of cultural and societal upheaval. Manson's followers were not mindless robots. They were people much like any of us who found themselves at a crossroads in life. They were vulnerable, and Manson gave them an outlet, a reason to belong. They were willing to follow him because they wanted to feel that they had a purpose, something larger than themselves. In the end, they lost their humanity. But there's a deeper question buried in the ashes of this dark tale. How much of ourselves are we willing to give away in the search for meaning? It is this question that has haunted the survivors of the Manson family, and it is this question that we must all grapple with. The road to manipulation is paved with good intentions, and the need for connection is one of the most powerful human forces. As you close your eyes tonight, think about this. In a world that constantly changes, how much of your sense of self do you allow others to shape? How easy would it be to be led astray, to give up control of your thoughts and your beliefs to someone who promises you answers, who offers you a place to belong? The Manson family murders serve as a stark reminder to never let go of your autonomy. Never surrender your ability to question and challenge. In the end, the true horror is not just in what happened, but in what could have been. It is a story of fragility, of how easily the human mind can be twisted and manipulated, and a warning that we must always be vigilant, questioning the world around us, the leaders we follow, and the ideas we embrace. If we don't, we risk losing ourselves just as Manson's followers had. As the night settles, let your thoughts wander and reflect. The darkness around us is not always the most frightening thing. It is the vulnerability within the places where we seek meaning and connection that make us susceptible to the pull of others. Stay aware. Stay true to yourself. And remember, the greatest power lies not in the vision of another, but in your own ability to choose your path. The world moves on as it always does, but the scars left by the Manson family murders remain deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness. For those who lived through it, for the families who lost loved ones, for the survivors who can never fully escape the grip of their past. The passage of time does little to erase the horror. The Manson family was a product of their time, a time when the world seemed ripe for radical change, and when the search for meaning, for belonging, ran deep in the veins of a disillusioned generation. The legacy of the Manson family is a lesson, one that speaks not just to the dangers of cults and manipulation, but to the human need for connection, purpose, and identity. Manson offered a distorted version of that connection, a twisted vision that promised power and purpose, but ultimately delivered only destruction. His followers, drawn to his charisma and his promises of belonging, had no idea the price they would pay. They were swept into a belief system so perverse, so far removed from reality, that it took lives, innocent lives, and tore apart families never to be fully repaired. In the years since Manson's conviction, there have been efforts to understand how such manipulation could happen. How did a man with no real power, no wealth, no influence manage to sway so many people? The answer lies in his ability to tap into something deeply human, our need for connection. Manson preyed upon vulnerable individuals who were searching for something to believe in, for something that would give their lives purpose. In a world that was changing rapidly, Manson provided a semblance of order, of certainty. But that certainty was built on lies. Manson's power over his followers was not just physical. It was psychological. He convinced them that they were part of something bigger than themselves, something that would change the world. He painted a picture of revolution, of chaos, of an apocalypse that would cleanse the earth. And they believed him. They didn't just follow him, they believed in him. They believed in his vision. And in doing so, they gave up their ability to reason, to question, to see the truth of the violence they were being led to commit. The psychological aspect of the Manson family story is perhaps the most disturbing. It's not the murder itself that is the true horror, but the way Manson manipulated their minds, warped their perceptions of right and wrong. His followers weren't just following orders. They believed they were part of a divine mission. Their faith in Manson's words was so absolute that it justified the bloodshed, the chaos, the pain. And for those who survived the aftermath, was a lifetime of struggle to reconcile what they had done with the person they once were, the person they hoped to become. But beyond the question of how Manson's followers were so easily manipulated, there is the question of why. Why does it happen? Why are some people so susceptible to these kinds of ideas, to these kinds of leaders? The answer is not simple, but it is clear. It is the human need for meaning. In times of uncertainty, people are willing to give up their autonomy, their critical thinking, to find something that promises answers, that promises purpose. And that is what Manson offered: answers to questions that had no easy answers. He filled the void left by the confusion and uncertainty of the times, and in doing so, he took control of minds that had been searching for direction. Even now, Manson's influence remains an unsettling reminder that such manipulation can happen again. In a world that is still full of division, fear, and uncertainty, there will always be those who prey on those vulnerabilities. The Manson family murders are not just an isolated incident. They are a warning that the search for purpose can be dangerous, especially when it leads us to people who exploit our need for meaning. The world continues to change, but the lessons from the past are more relevant now than ever before. The legacy of the Manson family serves as a reminder of the darker aspects of the human condition. It is not just the story of a group of followers who committed murder. It is the story of how easily one person can gain control over others, how the mind can be manipulated, how belief can become dangerous. The darkness that Manson tapped into wasn't something unique to him. It's a part of the human experience, and it will always be with us. The question is whether we can recognize it, whether we can see it before it's too late. As time passes, the world will continue to evolve, and so too will the ways in which people are led astray. The dangers of Manson's influence may seem distant, but they remain close, lurking in the background of a world that still grapples with the desire for connection, purpose, and meaning. As you lay down tonight, think about this. The human mind is both fragile and resilient. In the right hands, it can be shaped, molded, and manipulated in ways we can hardly fathom. But it is also capable of great strength, of recognizing falsehoods, of rejecting that which does not serve us. The key is never to stop questioning, never to stop seeking the truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable that truth may be. As the night deepens, the weight of the Manson family story continues to linger in the air, not just as a historical event, but as a chilling reminder of the complexities of human psychology and the darker sides of our nature. For the survivors, for the families of the victims, and for those of us who look back in disbelief, the legacy of Charles Manson is a harsh reality, a truth that will never fully fade from our collective memory. It's easy to view the Manson family murders as something from the distant past, something that belongs to a time of social upheaval, of political unrest. But the more we reflect on the story, the more we realize that the conditions that allowed Manson to gain control over so many people are not limited to the 1960s. The vulnerability that Manson exploited, loneliness, a desire for purpose, a thirst for meaning in a world of confusion, still exists today. In fact, it may even be more pronounced now in a world that is filled with noise and distraction, where so many are searching for something to believe in. Manson didn't just see himself as a leader. He saw himself as a messiah, a prophet. He capitalized on the distrust of the establishment and the widespread cultural shifts of the time. His ability to tap into that disillusionment, to offer an alternative reality, was what made him so dangerous. His followers, many of them young, searching for something more, were drawn in by the promise of belonging. What Manson offered was more than just a cause. It was a family, a sense of inclusion in something that gave them power. But in reality, it was the illusion of power, a power rooted in violence and control. What makes the Manson family story even more unsettling is the realization that Manson's grip wasn't just physical, it was mental, spiritual, and emotional. He didn't just command his followers to kill, he convinced them that it was their moral duty, that they were instruments of a higher purpose. The violence they committed was not seen as a crime, but as an act of revolution. The horror lies not just in the brutality of the murders, but in the psychological manipulation that made them possible. As the years went by, the world watched as some of Manson's followers tried to atone for their actions. For many, there was no real redemption. Some spoke publicly of their remorse. Others remained silent, haunted by the memories of what they had done. But no amount of time could erase the memories of that night, the victims, the blood, the lives taken in the name of a madman's vision. And for the survivors, their suffering continued, not just from the loss of their loved ones, but from the painful realization of how easily they had been drawn into the madness. Manson's death in 2017 marked the end of an era for his followers, but it did not erase the terror he had caused. In the years since, the fascination with the Manson family has only deepened. Documentaries, books, and podcasts continue to explore their story, trying to understand how Manson was able to wield such power, but no amount of analysis can fully explain it. Manson's power wasn't something that could be easily understood or defined. It wasn't just about manipulation, it was about a warped worldview, a vision of chaos and control that found fertile ground in the minds of vulnerable individuals. And that perhaps is the most terrifying aspect of Manson's legacy, his ability to create a world, a reality that others could not only believe in, but act upon. His words became gospel, his delusions reality. And in that reality, the most grotesque acts of violence were justified. It wasn't just the killings, it was the destruction of everything these people had believed in, everything they had once stood for. They became pawns in a game they didn't fully understand, and the blood they shed would stain them forever. While we may never fully understand the depths of Manson's manipulation, the lessons of his story are painfully clear. The human mind is susceptible to suggestion, to influence, and to the distortion of reality. Even the most intelligent, the most rational, can be swayed by the right words at the right time. The Manson family murders were not the result of a few broken individuals. They were the product of a carefully crafted ideology, a toxic vision that preyed on the vulnerable. Today, as the world continues to grapple with the rise of extremism cults and radical ideologies, we must ask ourselves, how can we prevent another Manson from ever rising again? How can we protect ourselves from those who seek to manipulate, to control, to destroy? The answer lies in awareness, in the recognition that the danger isn't always in the overt acts of violence we see on the surface, but in the insidious whispers, the slow burn of persuasion that convinces us to abandon our beliefs, our morals, and our sense of self. Perhaps it is fitting that the Manson family murders remain a cautionary tale. They remind us that the true horror lies not just in the acts of violence themselves, but in the twisted minds of those who can make others believe that such acts are justified. In the end, the question isn't how we can prevent another Manson. It's how we can recognize the warning signs before it's too late, how we can protect ourselves and others from the subtle destructive power of manipulation. As the night grows quieter, the weight of this truth lingers in the stillness. We must never stop questioning, never stop searching for the truth, and never allow ourselves to be swayed by those who would lead us down a dark, dangerous path. The Manson family story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest evil comes not from the world outside, but from within. The passage of time has softened the sharp edges of many historical events, but some stories remain as raw and haunting as the day they first occurred. The Manson family murders are one of those stories so horrific in their brutality and so deeply ingrained in the public consciousness that they continue to echo through the decades, unsettling us in ways that go beyond the bloodshed. As we move further from the summer of 1969 when the murders unfolded, the question still lingers. Why? What drove these individuals, ordinary people? Some of them searching for a place to belong, others simply lost in the chaos of the world around them to commit such horrifying acts. It is a question that remains unanswered, not just in the context of the Manson family, but in the larger context of human nature itself. The tragedy wasn't just the murders themselves, it was the psychological hold Manson had over his followers. He didn't just inspire them to kill, he convinced them that they were part of a greater mission, a revolution that would forever change the world. It wasn't simply blind obedience, it was a dangerous and intoxicating sense of purpose. And when that sense of purpose was wrapped in the delusions of a man like Manson, the results were catastrophic. But there's more to the story than just Manson's manipulation. The legacy of the Manson family murders serves as a warning about the power of isolation, the dangers of losing one's sense of self in the search for belonging. The world of the 1960s was a time of transformation, of cultural upheaval, social change, and a deep sense of disillusionment. Many were searching for something to anchor them, something to hold on to, in a world that seemed to be falling apart. In that search, they found Manson, and that's where the true terror lies. Manson's influence wasn't just about his ability to manipulate the vulnerable. It was about how easily he could take those who were already questioning their place in the world and twist their perceptions, bend them to his will. He took their uncertainty, their need for direction, and exploited it to his advantage, turning them into instruments of violence. The world at the time seemed to be teetering on the edge of chaos. People were looking for answers, for meaning, for a sense of stability. Manson gave them that, at least that's what they thought. He offered them the illusion of certainty, the illusion of a cause. And in exchange for that, they gave up their morals, their identities, their humanity. When the murders took place, it wasn't just the violence that was shocking. It was the fact that Manson had made them believe that this violence was part of something important, something grand. They were convinced that they were part of a revolution, part of a mission that would cleanse the world and bring about change. But in reality, they were simply pawns in a delusional game, a game that left devastation in its wake. For the survivors, for the families of the victims, the journey to recovery was a long one. It wasn't just the loss of life that haunted them. It was the question of how it had happened, why it had happened, and what they could have done to stop it. For those who had been involved in the murders, the weight of their actions could never be fully lifted. The regret, the guilt was a heavy burden, one they would carry for the rest of their lives. The Manson family murders are often seen as an anomaly, a dark chapter in the story of the 1960s. But perhaps that is part of the horror. They were not an anomaly. They were a reflection of something deeper, something more pervasive in human nature. They were a reminder that the potential for manipulation, for radicalization, exists within us all. In times of uncertainty, in times of cultural upheaval, we are all vulnerable to the promises of those who seek to exploit our need for purpose, our need for belonging. And as time continues to pass, as the world continues to change, the questions remain. Could something like the Manson family murders happen again? Could another figure rise to power, preying on the vulnerabilities of those around them, convincing them to follow blindly, to do terrible things in the name of a cause? The answer, sadly, is that it could. The same psychological forces that Manson exploited remain just as potent today as they were then. The story of the Manson family is not just a tragedy about a series of brutal murders. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing ourselves in the search for something greater. It's a reminder that we must always be aware of the voices around us, the leaders who promise answers, the ideologies that seem too good to be true. The Manson family murders are a chilling reminder that when we stop questioning, when we stop thinking critically, we leave ourselves open to the darkest corners of human manipulation. In the quiet of the night, as you reflect on the story of the Manson family, remember this: the true danger is not just in the violence itself, but in the ways that we allow our own vulnerabilities to be exploited. The Manson family murders serve as a warning that we must never stop questioning, never stop seeking truth, and never lose sight of the power we have to shape our own beliefs and our own destinies. As the darkness settles around you, let your thoughts settle too. Remember that the past is not just a collection of events. It is a mirror reflecting back the choices we make, the vulnerabilities we hold, and the way we respond to the world around us. Keep your eyes open, your mind sharp, and never forget, the greatest horror comes not from the world outside, but from the darkness that can sometimes lurk within. As the years unfurled after the Manson family's reign of terror, the societal landscape began to change, but the scars of the murders, the manipulation, and the horror of those deaths lingered. What had been a gruesome chapter in the annals of history continued to resurface in unsettling ways, reminding us that the line between good and evil, between sanity and madness, is thinner than we would like to believe. For many, the chilling aspect of the Manson family story was not simply that a man like Manson could exist, but that he was able to convince others to manipulate those around him so thoroughly that they committed atrocities in his name. Manson's ability to prey on the fragile human mind to convince people to abandon their core beliefs and follow him was as terrifying as the murders themselves. But the true horror came from the realization that Manson wasn't alone in his ability to manipulate minds. There were and are others who have followed the same playbook, leading people down similar dark paths. The Manson family murders opened up an unsettling dialogue about the psychology of cults' power and influence. It forced society to confront uncomfortable truths that under the right circumstances, people could be manipulated to do terrible things. This reality doesn't just apply to the Manson family. It applies to every situation where people are vulnerable and desperate, searching for meaning or belonging in a world that can sometimes feel lost and chaotic. For Manson's followers, it wasn't just about the murders. It was about the way they were convinced that their violence was justified. They weren't simply carrying out orders, they were fulfilling what they thought was their destiny. They were convinced they were part of something bigger, something world-changing, something that would bring about a new age. The horrifying part is that Manson made them believe they were doing the right thing, making them see themselves as agents of a revolution. The violence was wrapped in the promise of purpose of belonging, and that made it all the more terrifying. And it wasn't just the followers who were affected by Manson's manipulation. Society as a whole was forced to reckon with the implications of such power. How did a man with so little to offer, with no real platform or influence, manage to draw in so many? What does that say about the human condition, about our capacity for critical thinking, our ability to distinguish truth from falsehood? The Manson family murders were not just a crime against individuals, they were a crime against society, a reflection of how vulnerable the human mind can be when it is searching for meaning and how easily it can be twisted by the right or wrong person. The question then is not whether the Manson family murders were an isolated event. They were not. What we must ask ourselves is whether we are vulnerable to the same tactics, the same type of manipulation that Manson used to incite such violence. Are we capable of being so blinded by a leader, a cause, or an idea that we too might lose our sense of self, our moral compass, in the name of something we believe is greater than us? The world hasn't changed all that much since 1969. We are still searching for meaning, still yearning for connection, still looking for ways to understand a world that often feels as if it's slipping through our fingers. Manson's followers were not evil from the start. They were young, impressionable, and lost. Many had grown up in broken homes or had been cast aside by society. They were searching for a family, a place where they could belong, where their lives would have meaning. Manson gave them that. He offered them a sense of purpose in an uncertain world, and when they followed him, they believed they were part of something greater. But in doing so, They lost their autonomy. They gave up their ability to question, to think critically, and ultimately they gave up their humanity. And it's here that we find the most terrifying part of the Manson family story. The manipulation wasn't just psychological, it was a spiritual destruction. Manson didn't just bend their wills, he broke them down, distorted their sense of reality, and made them believe that violence was not only necessary, but righteous. That belief, that distorted sense of right and wrong, led to murder. And once that line had been crossed, there was no going back. But the story doesn't end there. As we look back on the Manson family murders, we have to ask, how can we ensure that we are not vulnerable to the same manipulation? How can we protect ourselves and others from falling prey to the same promises, the same illusions of belonging that led Manson's followers to commit such unimaginable acts? The answer lies in awareness. It lies in the understanding that the human mind is easily influenced, but that influence can be resisted. It lies in fostering critical thinking, in teaching the value of questioning, in ensuring that we never lose sight of who we are and what we believe. Manson's death was the end of an era, but it wasn't the end of the lessons we must learn from the Manson family murders. The story of the Manson family is a warning one that tells us that vulnerability is a dangerous thing, that the human need for connection can be exploited, and that sometimes the greatest evil doesn't come in the form of violence, but in the form of words, promises, and manipulations. As you reflect on the story of the Manson family, consider this: the darkness that Manson tapped into is not gone. It may lie dormant, but it can rise again if we are not careful. We must remain vigilant, aware of how easily we can be misled, and how quickly we can lose ourselves in the search for purpose. The Manson family story is not just a historical lesson. It's a timeless one, relevant in every era, every moment, when we are searching for meaning in a chaotic world. As you rest tonight, remember the world is full of voices that promise answers. Some of those voices seek only to manipulate. Never forget to listen critically, to trust yourself, and to never lose sight of your own sense of truth. The story of the Manson family may have ended, but the lessons it leaves us with must be carried forward always. The darkness of the Manson family's story continues to linger long after the crimes were committed, woven into the fabric of cultural memory. For those who lived through it, the weight of the tragedy remains heavy, while for those who learn of it from a distance, there's an undeniable fascination with how such evil could have blossomed from the human mind. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, not because of its shock value or sensationalism, but because of the lessons it continues to teach us. As the years went by, it became evident that the Manson family's murders were not isolated incidents. They were a mirror of something deeper, something darker, embedded in the psychology of manipulation and power. Charles Manson didn't simply convince his followers to kill for him. He convinced them to abandon everything they knew to be true, to surrender their personal morality, and replace it with his twisted vision. This was a power of a kind that transcended the traditional methods of coercion and violence. Manson wielded an invisible weapon, the ability to control and warp perception. The true horror of the Manson family murders lies in the way Manson distorted reality for his followers. He did not use physical force to subdue them. He used words. He didn't just break their will. He manipulated their beliefs and twisted their minds into accepting a narrative that justified horrific violence. In their eyes, they were not committing murder. They were fulfilling a divine calling, a cosmic mission to rid the world of its impurities. The power of belief, when corrupted and weaponized, became a tool of unspeakable destruction. For the survivors, the long journey of regret and redemption was never simple. Some of Manson's followers spent years behind bars, while others lived in the public eye, their every word scrutinized. But for all of them, the shadows of their actions never fully disappeared. The question of how they could have been so easily manipulated remained an open wound. Could they ever forgive themselves? Could they ever truly reconcile the person they had been with the actions they had taken? For many, the quest for redemption was a lifelong struggle. The guilt, the shame, the weight of what they had done, these were burdens they could never fully escape. Even as they sought to make amends, the horrors of the murders were ever present, haunting their every attempt to move forward. The struggle to atone for such a monumental act of violence is not easily done, and for some, it's a battle they fought until their last days. But it wasn't just those who committed the murders who were left to pick up the pieces. The world itself was left to deal with the ramifications of Manson's actions. Society was forced to reckon with the disturbing truth that such a man could not only exist, but could also convince others to follow him so blindly. It wasn't just the tragedy of the murders that left a lasting scar. It was the unsettling realization that at any given time, someone else could rise to take Manson's place, to use the same techniques, the same psychological tools to control and manipulate the minds of others. What Manson taught us, whether we want to admit it or not, is that the human mind is more vulnerable than we care to admit. Manson's followers were not brainless drones. They were individuals, each with their own desires, dreams, and insecurities. Manson knew this. He understood that in a world filled with chaos, uncertainty, and a yearning for purpose, people would always be looking for something to cling to. He gave them that, and in doing so, he stole their identities, their morals, and ultimately, their humanity. The most terrifying realization of all is that Manson's influence wasn't limited to those who followed him. His story, his method, his ability to twist the minds of others is a warning to us all. In a world that is constantly changing, that is constantly in flux, it is far too easy for someone to rise and prey on the vulnerabilities of those who are seeking answers, who are searching for meaning. Manson's reign of terror didn't just occur in isolation. It was a product of its time. Yes, but it also tapped into something universal. The desire to belong, to feel important, to be part of something larger than oneself is a powerful force, and that force can be used for good or for evil. Manson's death didn't end the lessons his story has to offer. We still live in a world where leaders rise promising change, offering purpose, and manipulating those who are searching for answers. His story is timeless because the dynamics of influence, control, and manipulation haven't changed, they've only evolved. Today, we are still vulnerable to the same forces that allowed Manson to take control of a group of people. The tools may be different, but the essence of the manipulation remains the same. As you reflect on the story of the Manson family tonight, take a moment to think about this. The power to influence others, to shape minds, is not inherently evil. But when that power is used for destruction, when it is used to break down the walls of reason and morality, it becomes dangerous. The Manson family's story reminds us that we must always be vigilant against those who would seek to manipulate, who would twist the truth and bend our perceptions for their own gain. The human mind is a fragile thing capable of great things, but also vulnerable to those who would prey upon its weaknesses. As we navigate the world around us, we must never forget that the line between truth and illusion is sometimes thinner than we think, and that the greatest horrors can come not from what we can see, but from what we believe. As you settle into the quiet of the night, remember, The power of belief is strong, but so is the power of awareness. Always be vigilant and never stop questioning the world around you. The Manson family story serves as a warning that we must never let our search for meaning blind us to the reality of what is happening around us. Be aware of the forces that seek to shape your thoughts, and always trust your own understanding of the world. The Manson family story, though it seems like a chapter that should have closed long ago, continues to reverberate. The echoes of their actions stretch far beyond the bloodshed, far beyond the years in which the murders took place. It is a story that refuses to be buried, because it is a story that speaks to something deeper, something timeless. It speaks to the human condition, the need for belonging, for purpose, and for a vision that gives our lives meaning. It speaks to the vulnerability of the human psyche and the terrifying potential for manipulation when those needs are preyed upon. For the followers who were caught up in Manson's delusions, it was not just about the murders. It was about the promises Manson made, promises of belonging, of revolution, of a world that would finally make sense. Manson knew how to exploit their pain, their insecurities, and their yearning for something more. He didn't just manipulate them into committing violence. He manipulated their very sense of self. And that is where the real horror lies. What Manson created was not just a group of followers, it was a warped family, bound by the belief that they were part of something greater than themselves, that they were serving a purpose that transcended the ordinary world. Manson made them believe that their violence was justified, that they were agents of a revolution. The murders they committed weren't seen as cold-blooded acts of violence. They were seen as part of the cosmic plan that Manson had laid out for them. The true horror of the Manson family murders lies in the way Manson was able to make his followers believe that they were doing the right thing. They weren't just following orders. They were fulfilling a higher calling. The murders weren't just murder. They were part of a divine mission. And in that, Manson did something far more insidious than just cause death. He destroyed the moral compass of his followers. He made them abandon their sense of right and wrong, and in doing so, he led them down a path that no one should ever have to walk. As time went on, the survivors of the Manson family, those who had been involved in the killings but later turned against Manson's vision, were left to live with the consequences of their actions. Could they ever fully atone for what they had done? Could anyone who had committed such horrors ever truly find peace? The question haunted them for years. The scars of their involvement in the Manson family's madness were not just physical, they were psychological. And while some sought redemption, tried to make amends, the truth was that no amount of time could ever fully erase the weight of the crimes they had committed. But Manson's influence didn't end with his followers. The horror of the Manson family murders was also a reflection of a wider societal vulnerability. It was a reminder that even the most rational, the most educated, the most grounded individuals can fall prey to the charisma of a manipulative leader. It was a warning that the search for meaning, for purpose, for belonging can make us vulnerable to those who would exploit our desires for their own gain. In a world that is filled with uncertainty, where the search for truth and belonging often leaves us vulnerable to the whims of others, the Manson family's story serves as a cautionary tale. The events of 1969 didn't just affect the lives of those directly involved, they affected the very fabric of society. They revealed a terrifying truth that human beings are capable of much more than we like to admit. When pushed to the edge, when led astray by the wrong leader, the darkest parts of our nature can emerge. And that is a chilling reality to face. As the years pass, we are left with the lessons that Manson's crimes have imparted upon us. We must always question, always challenge, and always remain aware of the forces that seek to control us. The Manson family murders weren't just the result of one man's madness. They were the result of a larger societal condition, of a culture in turmoil, and of human beings who were searching for meaning in a world that often seemed to offer none. Manson's death did not put an end to the story. It did not end the fascination with the Manson family or with the psychology of cults. It did not put a stop to the questions we continue to ask about manipulation, power, and influence. But it did give us the chance to look at the legacy he left behind and understand that the dangers he posed were not confined to one time or place. Manson's story is a reflection of the vulnerabilities we all share. It is a story that continues to serve as a warning, reminding us that we must never take for granted our ability to think critically, to question authority, and to never lose sight of our own moral compass. The Manson family's story is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a living, breathing, cautionary tale. It is a story about the dangers of unchecked power, the manipulation of the human mind, and the devastating consequences that can result when people lose themselves in the pursuit of something greater. And as we move forward, we must remember that the lessons of the past are never fully learned. The potential for manipulation, for exploitation, is always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to prey on the vulnerable. As the night draws to a close and the world quiets around you, think about this. The greatest power lies not in the leaders who command us, but in the choices we make, the ideas we embrace, and the ways in which we hold on to our sense of self. In the end, the story of the Manson family is not just about murder. It's about control, about the vulnerability of the human spirit, and about the dangers of losing sight of who we are and what we believe. May you rest tonight with the knowledge that though the past is never fully gone, we have the power to learn from it. Stay vigilant, stay true, and always trust your own understanding of the world around you. The darkness that Manson embodied may have faded, but its lessons endure, and they must never be forgotten. Even as the decades stretch further from the horrifying events that defined the Manson family, their legacy endures not only in the history books, but in the subconscious of society itself. We've tried to move on to put the nightmare behind us, but the story of Charles Manson and his followers still lingers like a shadow. It's not just the memory of the murders, but the far deeper fear of what they represented, a psychological manipulation so deep that it led to the destruction of lives and the corruption of minds. Manson's ability to convince people that his twisted ideology was not only valid, but righteous, is what sets his story apart from mere violence. It wasn't simply that he preyed upon the vulnerable, it was that he tapped into the universal human need for meaning, for a connection to something larger than oneself. That connection, that promise of belonging, is often what drives people to seek answers in places they might not otherwise go. Manson offered them something they thought they were missing, and for a time, they followed him to their own destruction.